Number 1. Departure. December 1606. A chronicle of men and their desires. There are moments in the history of nations, and indeed in the history of the human soul, when fate, weary of operating through the slow machinery of ordinary circumstance, elects to compress an entire epoch into the space of a single morning. Such a morning came to Blackwall on a cold Tuesday in December of the year 1606, though no poet was there to consecrate it, and the dock workers who witnessed it paused only briefly before returning to their barrels and their ropes, ignorant as all men are ignorant of the enormous dramas being performed at the edges of their vision. 3 ships lay at anchor in that grey water, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. They were not magnificent vessels. History, in its customary fashion, would later describe them as heroic, which is the word civilization uses for things that were merely desperate. The Thames moved beneath their hulls with the sullen patience of something that has witnessed too many departures to be moved by another, and the gulls wheeled overhead in their eternal indifference. Those white commissioners of meaninglessness, who have watched the rise and fall of every ambition since the first ambitious man built his first fire on a shore. The smell was of tar and rot, and the peculiar wretchedness of winter at low tide, which is to say, it was the smell of England, stripped of its pretensions. England without its wigs and its ceremony and its warm parlors full of men explaining why they themselves need not go anywhere dangerous. 104 men stood upon those decks, or moved about the docks in the final preparations of departure, and it would require a considerable philosopher, or perhaps a considerable novelist, to inventory the varieties of human hope and human delusion that moved among them like a separate population. There were gentlemen of the 2nd and 3rd rank, those younger sons whom primogeniture had effectively condemned to irrelevance at home, and whom the Virginia Company had offered the extraordinary gift of elsewhere. There were craftsmen and laborers, men whose hands knew work in the way that a soldier's hands know weapons intimately without romance. There were speculators in human form, men who had calculated the probable return on suffering and found it acceptable. And there was, standing apart from all of them at the rail of the Susan Constant, with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to spend his interior life in private, a soldier of 26 years whose name was John Smith, and in whose chest, beneath a coat that had seen rougher business than this cold dock, something burned that was not quite ambition, and not quite love, and was perhaps the thing that lives between them, which has no name in any language, because the men who feel it most keenly are rarely the men given to naming things. Let us speak plainly of John Smith, since the age he lived in never did. He was a farmer's son from Lincolnshire, which in the social mathematics of Jacobean England meant that he had been assigned his ceiling at birth. A low ceiling, well furnished perhaps, respectable enough, but a ceiling nonetheless, beyond which a man of his origins was not expected to pass without making those above him deeply uncomfortable. He had declined to respect this arrangement. He had gone to France as a boy and fought before he had finished growing. He had sailed the Mediterranean when other men his age were learning to manage inheritances they had done nothing to earn. He had crossed into the killing grounds of Hungary and Transylvania, and there, in the mud and blood of wars fought against the Ottoman tide, he had discovered what he was made of, which is to say, he had been tested in the particular crucible that strips a man to his essence, and what remained after the burning had been something harder and darker than what he had begun as, compressed by experience, the way that coal is compressed in the deep places of the earth, patient and dense and waiting. He had been captured. He had been sold as a slave to a Turk, as one might sell a horse or a bolt of cloth, with no more ceremony than commerce requires. He had killed his master, the accounts suggest with agricultural efficiency, and walked out of captivity through Russia and Poland, through landscapes of impossible cold and impossible scale, on feet that had learned to keep moving when the mind had exhausted every argument for stopping. He had returned to England in 1604 with nothing to show for the years, except scars that the flesh carries quietly and a restlessness that had no cure because no English landscape was wide enough to contain it. England was, to most men of his time, the center and crown of the knowable world. To Smith it had come to feel. And here is where the tragedy of certain natures reveals itself. Like a room in which the furniture had been arranged by other people for other purposes, in which a man of his particular dimensions could not move without knocking something over and being blamed for it. He had a reputation, which is a very different thing from having a place. The men of the Virginia Company spoke of him in their smoky London offices as capable, experienced, useful. And in this usage of the word useful lay the entire pathos of his situation. Useful men are retained until they are inconvenient, and then they are discarded with the same efficiency and roughly the same guilt that one discards a tool that has served its purpose. Smith knew this with the bone-deep knowledge of a man who has watched it happen enough times to understand it as a law of human nature, rather than a particular malice of particular men. He was a farmer's son. In a venture crowded with titled gentlemen and their adequately credentialed relatives, that fact would follow him like a sentence. Not spoken, but understood. Not written, but enforced. And yet he had volunteered. He had sought this out. He had pressed his case in those smoky offices with the quiet, persistent force of a man who knows that the first answer is rarely the final one. He had wanted this voyage in the way that men sometimes want things whose dimensions they cannot fully see. Not for the reasons they give themselves at the time, which are always simpler and more socially respectable, but for a deeper reason that only becomes legible later, when the distance of years allows the larger shape to emerge. Standing at the rail as Blackwall's grey silhouette began to dissolve into grey morning. As England, that well-furnished cage, that comfortable and immovable argument against him, receded across the water, he understood something he had not quite permitted himself to understand until this moment. He wanted a place that did not already know what he was. He wanted a territory in which the story had not yet been written, not because he was certain he would write something worthy, but because the blank page, with all its terror and all its openness, at least offered possibilities that a page already covered in someone else's handwriting did not. There is a specific hunger in certain human beings for the unmapped, for the place beyond the last margin of the known chart. And it is neither greed, nor madness, nor simple restlessness. It is something closer to a theological conviction, an article of faith that the world is larger than what has already been claimed, and that in that largeness there is something worth the cost of finding it. The Thames moved beneath the hull. The ships moved with the tide. England shrank, and John Smith watched it shrink, and felt something complex and unrepeatable that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe in documents and maps and letters that never quite captured the quality of that particular moment. Because the quality of such moments is not available to language, only to the body, which registers it in the chest and the eyes, which register it in the way that familiar shapes dissolve into distance, and the hands which grip the rail a little harder than the cold requires. 2. The crossing, and what it cost him. The Atlantic is not interested in the opinions of the men who cross it. This was the first lesson of the voyage, and it took considerable time and considerable suffering to absorb. In London, men had spoken of the passage to Virginia with the breezy authority of the well-informed, who have never been required to test their information, and what they had described bore approximately the same relationship to the actual crossing as a military map bears to a battlefield. Accurate in its large features, catastrophically wrong in everything that matters. Understand this about the ocean. It does not distinguish between a gentleman and a laborer. It does not recognize the difference between a man whose grandfather held a title and a man whose grandfather held a plow. It applies its indifference with a perfect democracy that no human society has ever managed to replicate, and the nausea it produces is equally distributed among the proud and the humble. This was the central dramatic fact of the crossing, and it played out below decks with the grim comedy that attends the exposure of all pretense, which is to say, with cruelty, with smallness, with the particular viciousness that frightened men deploy against those they have decided to blame for their fear. The gentlemen were worst. They had arrived on the ships with their assumptions intact. The assumption that sea crossings, like all other unpleasant necessities of life, could be managed at a suitable remove from one's actual person. That a title is a kind of insulation against reality, that competence which they had never needed to cultivate would somehow arrive when required, the way that servants arrived when called. The sea disabused them of these notions with the thoroughness that only complete helplessness can provide. And their fear, curdled by weeks of confinement, by the stench below decks, by the groaning of timber in heavy weather, by the humiliating physicality of sickness, found its outlet, as fear always does, in grievance. Smith irritated them the way that genuinely capable men have always irritated the incapable, by being capable without apology. He knew the sailor's language of ropes and knots. He had navigated by stars across harder water than this. He ate what was given with a soldier's gratitude, which is no gratitude at all, but simply the absence of complaint. He worked when work was needed. He slept when sleep was possible. He conducted himself with the particular quietness of a man who has long since stopped requiring the approval of others in order to know his own value. And this quietness in the compressed social world of the ship was experienced by his anxious and status-conscious shipmates as a form of aggression. The man who is too comfortable in difficult circumstances makes those who are not comfortable feel that their discomfort is somehow their own failure. This is an intolerable perception, and men resolve it, as they have always resolved intolerable perceptions, by directing their anger at the person who occasioned it. Within weeks, the whispering began. Smith was plotting. Smith was dangerous. Smith wanted command and was maneuvering toward it with the subtlety of a man who knows how to move through institutions the way water moves through stone. Patient, persistent, leaving no visible mark until the stone has already given way. They arrested him. They put him in chains. He spent the remainder of the crossing, weeks more, months more, through the trade winds and the doldrums and the gradual agonizing approach of warmer latitudes, in irons below decks, listening to the language of the ship's hull, the grammar of its stresses and easings, the long, slow conjugation of water against wood, that a man learns to read when he has nothing else to read, all the time in the world in which to read it. Consider what this cost him and what it revealed. Anger is the first response to injustice. Clean, energetic, directed, sustaining. But anger is expensive, and the crossing was long, and eventually he moved through anger into something on the other side of it. Cold, crystalline clarity that is available only to men who have been stripped of everything except the quality of their own attention. He could not alter the fact of the chains. He could not alter the verdict of frightened men who had confused his competence with conspiracy. He could not determine whether he would live to stand on the soil of the world he had imagined. What remained to him was only the freedom to choose what he would do with his attention during the interval. And this he chose carefully, the way a general who has lost a battle chooses carefully the ground on which he will regroup. He thought about Virginia, not in the terms the Virginia Company used, not as a ledger of resources to be extracted, not as an extension of the commercial machinery of empire, but in the terms of a man who has crossed a great deal of difficult ground and learned to read a landscape the way a physician reads a face, for what it actually is, rather than what one hopes it to be. He thought about soil and water. He thought about what grows and what survives and what kills, and how one learns in a new country the difference between the three. He thought about the people who were already there, a fact that the Virginia Company's pamphlets addressed with a diplomatic vagueness that was indistinguishable from ignorance, and what those people would make of 104 exhausted, frightened, quarreling Englishmen appearing on their shore with a collection of instructions and ambitions that bore no relationship to the actual landscape being described. He thought, too, in the manner of a man who has no other companion in the dark, about love, not the love that attaches itself to persons, though he had known that in its ordinary iterations, of the rarer love that attaches itself to a condition, to a quality of existence that one has encountered in rare moments, and that one pursues across great distances, and through considerable suffering in the hope of finding it again. And this time, making it permanent. He had felt it on a ridgeline in Hungary, watching dawn arrive over a country so vast and various that it seemed to breathe, to have its own respiration, independent of all the small human dramas being conducted on its surface. He had felt it in a Greek harbor where the light on the water was so transparent and so clean that it constituted, for a moment, an argument for the existence of God. He had felt it whenever the world, for a suspended and unrepeatable instant, revealed itself as larger than the human mess living inside it. This feeling, he could not name it. Soldiers do not name feelings. They recognize them the way they recognize terrain, was what he was going toward. He wanted it to have an address. He wanted to be able to return to it. He wanted, if the word must be used, a home in it. And the word Virginia, which he had first heard spoken in a London office among men whose faces showed their calculations, even as their mouths made promises, had rung in him like a struck bell, which is to say, it had produced a resonance beyond the literal, had suggested a shape larger than its syllables. He was still in chains when the ships anchored in the Chesapeake on the 26th of April, in the year 1607. 3. The box, and the silence that followed it. Let history record this moment with the precision it deserves. Captain Newport, upon reaching the shores of the new continent, opened the sealed box that the Virginia Company had instructed him to open upon arrival. The box that contained, in the language of corporate governance dressed in the clothes of royal authority, the names of the men appointed to govern this infant enterprise of civilization, being conducted on the margin of a continent that had no interest in being the subject of anyone's enterprise. Smith's name was on the list. He was still in irons when they read it aloud. The silence that followed was one of the more perfect silences that life, in its occasional dark humor, arranges for the instruction of the proud. The men who had decided he was a conspirator, who had argued seriously, with the moral fervor of the genuinely frightened, that he deserved to hang, were now required to absorb the information that the institution whose honor they claimed to be protecting had considered him indispensable to its purposes. There is no elegant response to this kind of reversal, and the men around him did not find one. They stood in the silence with the particular discomfort of those who have discovered that their cruelty was also their error, which is a more bearable variety of shame than pure error, but not by much. Wingfield, who had refused him the oath of office, continued to refuse it. Smith would not be admitted to the council until June. The machinery of petty authority does not surrender its prerogatives simply because the universe has made its own judgment plain. He filed this information away. He had a talent, cultivated by experience, for filing things away, for noting the lesson without performing his reaction to it, storing the knowledge of what men were capable of in the ordinary exercise of their fear and pride, and drawing on that knowledge later when it was needed. He said nothing. He was, in the deepest sense, very good at saying nothing, when nothing was the most powerful thing available to say. But when they finally released him, when the irons came away and he was permitted to walk on the soil of Virginia for the first time, he stood for a moment at the edge of the water and felt something that no document he ever wrote managed to adequately preserve, though several of them circle it with the frustrated orbits of a man who knows that the thing he is trying to describe is larger than the medium he has available to describe it. It was joy. It was the pure form of the thing, uncomplicated by the machinery of human desire, uncontaminated by the specific ambitions and grievances and calculations that had surrounded it for months. The land was real. The trees came down to the water in walls of green, so ancient and dense they seemed to constitute a different order of existence, not hostile, not welcoming, but simply there, indifferent to England and its politics and its boxes and its oaths, alive with the enormous patience of the rooted world. Birds called from somewhere in the canopy in voices that had never learned the English names for things, and therefore named them differently with a wild freedom that the English had long since traded for precision. The air tasted of pollen and river mud and something else, something that he could not identify because it was the smell of a place that had not yet been altered by the presence of people who intended to alter it. A smell compounded of 10,000 years of growth and rot and growth again, of seasons turning without witness, of the world being entirely itself, without reference to human preference. He thought, here, this is it. He did not think it long because there were logs to cut and trenches to dig, and a colony to establish in the teeth of a landscape that had its own opinions about what would grow and what would survive and what would kill. But he thought it, and it was real, and it mattered, and the fact that he could feel it in the midst of months of humiliation and chains, and the small, relentless viciousness of frightened men, was perhaps the best evidence available that whatever he had come here for was not merely what he told himself he had come here for.